veteran is any person who has served honorably in any branch of the military of our government. That doesn't necessarily have to have been during wartime. We think of it more in wartime, but there were a lot of years in our nation's history when we were not at war, but we did have people who were serving. So anyone who has served honorably in any branch of the military is considered a veteran. At the present time, about half of the people who are now serving in the military, and particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, are people who are in the National Guard and Reserve units that have been called to active duty to help defend our country in those situations. My own experiences, I enlisted in the National Guard, in the Army National Guard, while I was a senior in high school, just before the end of my senior year in high school. We came out of a generation that was extremely patriotic because we grew up during a time when World War II was in place. Some of us were right on the verge of being called into the military during that war. We had many members of our family in that war. And people in that time were extremely patriotic because so many millions of people were involved in the war, and every family had someone who was fighting in World War II. Veterans Day was really established originally as Armistice Day, and the occasion came following World War I. That's a long time ago for young people today, but I remember people who were veterans in World War I because the concept of recognizing the people who had served in that war that was at that time thought to be the war that would end all wars was a way of recognizing the men and women who had served in the military, and most of those were men in those days. Very few women were in the service. Most of those women were as nurses. And they were recognizing those people who had been a part of that war, who had sacrificed their lives in many respects, some of them even to the point of death, but they had given so much to bring freedom to the world. So they recognized it at a day called Armistice Day. And then in the 1930s, while I was in elementary school, they decided that it should have an official recognition, and they declared it a holiday, and it was declared an Armistice Day, and we began celebrating that during the 1930s as an annual occasion on November 11. Well, November 11 was the day that the armistice was signed to end the war in Europe. The war with Germany, primarily with Germany, and it was signed on November 11th in France. It was signed at 11 o'clock on that day, and thus the occasion was the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, and that's why it was celebrated on November 11. The military is very critical to protecting our country because it would be nice if everybody in the world wouldn't just talk, but they do not. We witness all the time people who are wanting to take away from those countries that do have freedoms. They want to impose on other people their own will, and those things that they want to impose are different from the freedoms that we have enjoyed, the rights and benefits that we have enjoyed. And if there were not a military to protect our country, there would be others who would try to take over our country and impose on us their beliefs of various kinds. It's extremely critical that we have a very good military force that is available, that will step forth. At the present time, all our military force is a voluntary force, but there have been times in history, even in the Civil War days, but in World War I and World War II and the Korean War and the Vietnam War, when it was necessary to draft people into the military when there were not enough who were volunteering for service, and we had to have enough numbers to defend our country, and it was necessary to force people to come into the military through a type of law called the draft, in which They were young people of a certain age were just simply called to duty by their country, and they responded. So it was not unusual for young people my age, high school age, to be interested in joining the military. And I continued in that because I felt that it was very important to be available to defend our country. And we were called on a few years after that. In 1950, our unit was called on to go on active duty status because the Korean War had begun and our nation was being attacked by the communists, and it was very important that the United States take a position to try to defend the free world from being taken over by the communist forces. It was a difficult time fighting during the Korean War because it was a very vicious war. It was a Cold War. It was a war that has almost been forgotten by a lot of people because it came so close after World War II. But during that brief 3-year war, our nation had 150,000 people, mostly men, who were killed, wounded, or captured during that 3-year period. 50-something thousand of those were killed during that time in just 3 years. That was a lot of people. It's a massive number of people who had sacrificed their lives to help protect our country from being overtaken, or not just our country, but the free world from being overtaken by communism. And that was followed by the Cold War, and we continued in our military service and in National Guard and Reserve activities, some part-time active duty and some reserve activity during the years that followed. So I had about a 30-year career active in reserve forces in the military, and I enjoyed it. It was difficult, but I felt that we were accomplishing something in the way of helping preserve the freedoms that had been so hard fought for during the early days of our nation's history. And I think young people need to pick up that spirit of patriotism and recognize the need to honor people who have served, and observing Veterans Day is one way of doing that. I think there have been changes in the feelings about the military in more recent years, certainly from the World War II era to the present time. During the World War II and the Korean War era, more and more families had people who were involved in the military, so the families were very closely connected. Today, the nation doesn't appear to be in a mindset that the nation is at war. They say, well, the military is handling it, and we don't think about it every day in the same way that we did during the time of World War II, when everyone knew that they had an immediate family member who was there. There were about 16 million people who were in uniform during World War II. And that was at a time when our nation only had 137 million people in our country. We're 3 times larger than that as a population now, but we have about 2 million people who are in the military. So just a small percentage of our people are serving, and thus we are not as much aware of individuals who are in the service. And thus those families just don't give that much attention to it because they don't have any, in many families they don't have anyone who's serving. And it's such a small number that the people, as a general rule, just don't give that much thought to it. Well, the story of this nation is something that's very powerful. And many people take for granted the freedoms and the blessings that we enjoy as they do a lot of things of value. They just say, well, these just happened and we just enjoy them. But they didn't just happen. The freedoms that we have were won by people who responded to the call for military service from the very beginning of our country, when the Revolutionary War established our country, and then in the dozen wars that have followed, men and women stepped forth to serve in the military to not only establish the country, but to defend and to protect and preserve the freedoms and the blessings that we have. Young people need to know just how very close we came on some occasions to losing the war against fascism and against communism. Came very, very close at times to not being the country that we are. And young people need to be able to pick up that torch of patriotism that has been in our country's history from the very beginning, and that not take it for granted, but that do something to remember the people who helped preserve those freedoms for us. And those people are those that we call veterans, and it can be done in a number of ways. They can remember people in their own families who may have served. They can remember people who they know about who have served. They can do such things as just thanking people for their military service. They can demonstrate by waving the flag on that particular day, by putting the flag out in front of their home, and by observing ceremonies in school, and by listening to the stories of people who have served in the military, telling of their experiences, some good, not so good, that were people who helped preserve our nation's